Virgil's eyes drifted to the clock on his dresser. Though it was late for most people, 3 o'clock in the morning wasn't an unusual time for him to be awake. His nights were often spent thinking or brooding, while his companions rested, because, as his host's fight-or-flight reflex, sleep was all but out of the question for him. There was no way of knowing when there could be a break-in, freak natural disaster, or something even worse. That being the case, he couldn't allow himself to drift into the realm of dreams often, leading to days of no sleep, with occasional naps if he was completely certain that the other sides were in a position to watch over Thomas. Since the nights were generally uneventful, he was left to the mercy of his quiet yet mundane routine in the dim light of his room. He attempted to keep his focus on the book he had been reading, but the worries and fears he embodied tormented him relentlessly. Already his fingers had been picked to the point of bleeding, and his lip was nearly chewed through, but he continued to carry the burden of the late and lonely hours alone. He was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of footfall in the corridor, that while out of place, he had come to expect. More than once, the other sides had made it apparent that they abhorred the night for various and sundry reasons. Logan was always pressing for a healthy sleep schedule, Patton tried to enforce a strict bedtime, and Roman frequently complained about needing his beauty sleep. Despite the other side's insistence on the necessities of rest, it had become commonplace for Virgil to hear them wandering about the halls long after they had retired for the night. One afternoon he had questioned them on the topic, but each had denied staying awake or getting up, and he had instead received stern words about his own sleeping habits. At the time, he had allowed the topic to be pushed to the wayside and focused on more important matters, but as the nights passed, his curiosity only grew. His mind enjoyed playing tricks on him, so at first he had passed the sounds off as paranoia, but with the weeks slipping by and the trend continuing, he decided that he wasn't just hearing things. His senses were sharper than those of his colleagues, so even from behind a closed door, he was able to work out a rough pattern from the footsteps. He wasn't able to distinguish who was up, but the slight variations in the sounds betrayed that it wasn't just one side getting up regularly. Over the course of a single night, one to all of his friends would get up and walk around for a bit, sometimes more than once, but the individual incidents never lasted for more than 5 minutes. Finally, Virgil decided to ignore the others' claims and get to the bottom of the mystery which had plagued him for months. Silently, he placed his book on the bedside table and made his way across the carpeted floor. Opening the door with care, he stepped out into the darkness beyond his room. While waiting for his eyes to adjust, he listened intently until he recognized the upbeat, bouncy tread of Patton's footsteps. Turning in the direction of the sounds, Virgil was just barely able to make out his friend's silhouette, but there was something off about him. He seemed to be wandering about aimlessly, as if he had no destination in mind, or even a reason for being awake at all. Morality wore his dark gray cat onesie, with the hood pulled up over his head, though the mittens that went with it were missing. Virgil nearly ducked back into his room when Patton turned in his direction, but something told him he didn't need to. His companion was missing his glasses, and while his eyes were open, it was like he was focusing on something between the two of them. Suddenly things began to click into place. The footfall, the distant gaze, and the lack of memory. He was sleepwalking. Feeling confident in his answer to the enigma, he moved to return to his room, when the low tone of his counterpart caused him to stop. It had been too quiet to decipher what he had said, but anxiety decided to remain in the corridor nonetheless. Remaining still, he waited to see if Patton would speak again, and when he did, the words shocked Virgil to his very core.
What do you mean you don't need me anymore?
Before he had time to ponder what his companion had meant, he spoke once more, on the verge of tears.
I'm doing all I can, kiddos, please!
There was an abrupt pause, but his soft tone filled the air again a moment later.
You know that I only want what's best for all of you. I'll do anything. Don't make me leave. I don't want to lose any of you.
Morality's terrified whisper was cut short as he walked back into his corner of the Mind Palace, the door closing gently behind him. Anxiety remained where he was, frozen in shock. He knew that his friend never would have expressed such concerns had he been conscious, Perhaps he had just been having a nightmare. He shook his head. He knew better than anyone that nightmares often stemmed from worries and fears, even if those feelings were suppressed. That led him to an even more frightening thought. Was Patton truly afraid that the others didn't need him, and moreover that they would abandon him? Virgil slowly returned to his room, deciding that he would watch over his friend for a few more nights before addressing the topic directly. The next night, he sat by his door, awaiting the inevitable sounds of footsteps. But as he lingered in his room, the hours seemed to blur together. Boredom only worsened his mental state, but he didn't dare pick up his book for fear that he might miss the echo of footfall from the hallway. At last, he heard the sound of someone walking beyond the threshold, but to his surprise, the steps weren't Patton's. Listening to the confident and evenly paced stride, he opened his door. In the inky shadows of the corridor, he could just make out Logan's silhouette from the light which poured from his room. For a moment, anxiety found himself stifling a laugh as he took note of what his colleague was wearing. A white unicorn onesie, not dissimilar to the one Morality had been wearing the night before. Regaining his composure, Virgil noticed that Logan also lacked his glasses, and he held the same distant look in his eyes. One of the other side's sleepwalking was odd enough, but two seemed like more than just some coincidence. Maybe there was some correlation between the two. He swiftly decided he would ponder the idea more thoroughly at a later date, as Logan opened his mouth, his words a hushed whisper.
That's not what I meant.
Even though the edge of panic in his companion's voice sent a chill down his spine, Virgil dared to move a bit closer to his friend to ensure he could hear what was said.
How could my calculations of this incorrect? I didn't mean for any of this to happen.
Logic paused, making anxiety wonder if he was listening to only half of a conversation.
I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. This is my fault. All because I was wrong.
Slowly, Logan walked back to his corner of the mindscape, but just before the door clicked shut, Virgil could have sworn he heard the word
infinitesimal
go by. Thoughts raced through his head as he returned to his room. Two of the three others seemed to have developed a sleepwalking habit, but what was worse was how they vocalized things that they would never say otherwise. Once more, he found himself trying to accept that his friends were just having nightmares, but he knew there was much more to it than that. Patton could be extremely emotional, but his thoughts didn't usually run so dark that he would ever consider being cast out by the others. As the fight-or-flight reflex, he had a keen sense of what reactions each action could cause, and he had a nagging feeling that what he had seen was only the beginning of their ordeal. He wondered how he was going to keep track of both sides' sleepwalking episodes when an idea struck him. Rushing to his desk, he took a small black notebook from its drawers. If he was going to get to the bottom of this issue, he was going to have to think a bit like Logan and start taking some notes. His hand moved with amazing speeds as he wrote down both names, what the two had said, as well as the dates and times he heard them talking. If he kept a log, he would be able to compare what they said each night, and pinpoint the root of their fears. Maybe, just maybe, this was something he could do for the others. If they had deeper psychological issues that they were suppressing, perhaps he could help them through it. The next day, Virgil was lost in thought as time passed in a blur of activities, and for once in his life, he actually willed the night to approach faster, so he could continue monitoring Logic and Morality. As he saw them throughout the day, though, he was forced to act as if he was oblivious to what they had said the last few nights. It turned out that keeping up his usual disinterested facade was a bit more difficult when he was in a rush. Eventually, after the agony of waiting through the ridiculous banter of the more light-hearted duo, and Logan's deductions, the other sides finally retired for the night. Sitting in the silence of his room was no better. If anything, it was worse. Normally, he would scroll through Tumblr or listen to music to pass the time, but he couldn't risk the distraction. He had to listen, so he could discern the inevitable set of steps which would come from the hallway during the witching hours. Hours felt like minutes, and yet minutes felt like hours, to the point that he thought the night was never going to end. He was actually beginning to wonder if there was really anything to be concerned about, or if he was just working himself up over nothing when he heard it. the telltale creak of a door being opened, and the soft sounds of footfall outside his room. Turning the handle, he peered out into the shadows for the third time in as many nights, trying to figure out if it was Logan or Patton stumbling around, since when did any of the others stumble around? It was true, despite the fears they were forced to endure, both of the sides suffering with the nightmares had kept their normal walking pace. Until now. This didn't coincide with Logic's confidence or morality's cheer. Whoever was before him now was all but dragging their feet as they walked. After a moment, his eyes began to adjust to the gloom of the corridor, and he was taken by surprise when he didn't see Logan or Patton, but rather Roman. The prince wore a pair of red silk pajamas, with the letters RS monogrammed onto the front pocket, and ironically, he was more professionally dressed than either of the other two. Still, what concerned Virgil was how different his footsteps sounded. Normally, he walked with confidence, treading loudly, as if he wanted everyone to know when he was approaching. Now, he moved sluggishly, but there was more to the change in his stride than just exhaustion. Unlike the others, his shoulders were slumped forwards, his feet dragging at the carpet, and his head down, almost as if he maintained no connection to the person he was when he was awake. Pen in hand, Virgil waited to see if the only commonality Princey shared with the others was his sleepwalking, or if he had taken to speaking in his sleep as well. Silence enveloped them for so long that Virgil was beginning to wonder if the prince had been truthful when he had alluded to having no fears. But once more, he was proven wrong. A voice pierced through the quiet. But just like his tread, it sounded different. Rough, raspy, and dull, creating the feeling that he was too tired to make his vocal cords work properly.
No, this can't be.
His voice sounded deeper and disjointed, in a way which seemed almost familiar. After a moment, Anxiety found himself staring at his friend in shock as realization washed over him. Roman's voice sounded familiar because it shared many traits of Virgil's own intonation. The fear played a part in this change, but there was more to it than that. What made his voice so different from the others was the lower range and lack of effort he put into his words. Silence filled the air for only a moment before Princey continued.
Let me prove myself, my worth.
Anxiety nearly dropped his pen as he slowly lifted his head to look at his friend in the half-light.
Please. I'm not worthless.
The way he trailed off the sentence made Virgil feel as if he were once again listening to only one part of a conversation.
No, don't try and take it back now. You're right. You're all right.
Roman paused, letting his head fall.
I am worthless.
The last word hung in the air as the prince returned to his room, leaving Anxiety to try and take in everything he had just witnessed. He quickly jotted down his notes before walking back to his own corner of the mindscape. His mind reeled as he set the notebook back on the desk, mulling his friend's words over and over again. Did he really believe he was worthless? Ever since they were children, Roman had always seemed so confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance. Was it possible that his bold and brave nature was just a facade? In all the time they had known each other, Virgil never would have guessed they shared such a dark fear.